Morning, John.
Good morning, Charlene.
All right, got that shared over there. That there. Get my YouTube chat ready. All the different bells and whistles. Back to our text. I wish there was a way in Safaria to make the writing bigger without making all of the user interface bigger too. You know, I don't need to see the word Safaria so giant. But when you enlarge the text, you also enlarge all of the headers, the menus. I'll have to let them know that that's something they could work on. So sorry we missed studying Noach together last week.
And I was looking to see if you had on your Noah tie on Shabbat. I didn't notice it.
So my Noah tie, although I love it, it only works if I'm not wearing a jacket or a vest.
Okay.
Because it's solid black for like the top 2/3 of it.
Right.
And then at the bottom you have the arc and the rainbow. So it really doesn't look like a Noah tie to anyone unless I unbutton my jacket or unbutton my vest. And since the suit I wore was a button-up one, it meant I was out of luck.
Next year.
You know, it's not a bad theme for other times too, but
True.
I like to wear something a little bit more than just shirt and tie for Shabbat. So it does limit the way certain ties will be displayed. All right. Well, we've given our little buffer time, I think. So let's go ahead and get things moving. So we are picking up in Lechah, and we are going to be looking at chapter 14, which is a chapter that, in my opinion, does not get enough of an insight, enough discussion, because it is not a chapter that seems to fit most people's stereotypical view of Abraham. Most people, when they think of Abraham, or Avram, as he was known early in his life, tend to think of him as being a gentle and kind man, very almost meek. People have this whole idea of somehow that Abraham, well, I wouldn't want to use the modern word wimp, but he wasn't exactly Rambo. But chapter 14 completely goes against that idea. And it's important to understand that the idea that somehow meekness was closer to godliness, that not being able to fight was somehow more righteous, is not a very Jewish idea. David, we know, was a great warrior, as were many other people, such as Joshua and all of the judges, and that did not put them at odds with God. We do not glorify war in and of itself. War has to be done for a purpose, not just for glory, and war has to be done for the right purpose. So chapter 14, where we're going to discuss the unfolding of the war, is a rather important one, and hopefully the commentaries will shed light on the nature of this trouble in itself, as well as the nature of Abraham's role and God's role within all of this. So,
Rabbi, I had a good friend of mine attended the Naval Academy. He told me that all first-year students study this chapter when they learn about battle strategies.
That's interesting because there's not a whole lot of information given, just a few glimpses, some very interesting things that you might be able to deduce. But if I only had this to study for strategy, I'd be in trouble.
Well, but the idea you never leave a man behind, dividing your forces and attacking at night. Very much a special forces type of activity.
Very much indeed. But battles are usually not won, or wars are not usually won purely by special forces. Major contributions and major impacts, but usually you do need a large number of boots on the ground. And that issue is going to come back up later on when we talk about Abraham's victory. All right, so let's go ahead and get started in chapter 14 from verse 1. In order to get a full scope of what's going on here, we're going to be reading an extended passage, more than our usual half dozen verses or so. So buckle up. Now, when King Amraphel of Shinar, King Arioch of Elasar, King Chedorlaomer of Elam, and King Tidal of Goyim. Okay, first of all, now when? I just want to draw your attention to the phrasing, Vayehi b'mei, right? So this may sound familiar if you're used to the Megillah for Esther. Vayehi b'mei literally means, and it was in the days of. This is a particular, what's the right word? It's not exactly a technical, it's a literary device, a literary opening that is signaling a particular type of story. We're going to come back to that in our commentary, but I wanted to make sure you saw it in our first run through. So it had happened in the days of these different kings, these four kings, going on to verse 2, that they made war on King Bera of Sodom, King Birsha of Gomorrah, King Shinab of Admah, King Shemeber of Zeboim, and King Bela, which is Zoar. Okay, so what do we see? We have 4 kings in verse 1, and we have 5 kings in verse 2, which is why this whole chapter is sometimes referred to as the war between the 4 kings versus the 5. Because probably you're agreeing with me that you'd rather not have to remember all of these names every time you describe this particular incident. So what do we know about these people? Well, not a lot. We're going to try and dig a little bit out when we get to the commentary. But what do we know at least from the surface? Well, 2 names should in particular really shout out to us. And that, of course, is Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Gomorrah. So Sodom and Amorah were 2 kings that were the city-state kings of their respective cities on the Jordan Valley plain. And that should be ringing a bell in chapter 14 as a place where somebody went in the earlier stages of Abraham's life. That somebody, of course, was his nephew Lot. Lot and Abraham, you may remember, separated. They went their own ways, and Lot went down into Sodom and Gomorrah. So the fact that the war is happening in Sodom and Gomorrah is already tickling our keen reader memory that this may be the kind of thing which will involve Lot, and also by extension involve Abraham. That this is not just a random headline on the newspaper from the days of Abraham.
Rabbi, also Shinar, Babel, that section from last week's parashah.
Yes. So if we want to try and put at least a little bit more geography to this, it seems that Shinar, Arioch, and Chedorlaomer and Tidal of Goyim, that these kings were more easternly kings towards the fertile, the right-hand side of the Fertile Crescent, somewhere in Mesopotamia, somewhere in that either Babylon area or up into Assyria. Again, we don't have great archaeological markers for all of these, but at least biblically, they were considered to be eastern more kingdoms. So just to give a little bit of a background of what scholars have supposed of this time, is that this may have been a period of consolidating the vassal states that were in the Canaanite Confederacy. The area around Israel may have thought that they could combine together to push off the larger kings that lived in the Mesopotamian region, and the Mesopotamian kings are making their rounds, reestablishing their right to rule by force over these tributary towns of Sodom and Gomorrah, etc. But that is something that is based on speculation of how we know those ancient kingdoms behaved, but we don't have 100% proof that that's exactly what's happening here. But it's certainly a probable and definitely plausible explanation of why they're going to war. That is to say that one group has been extorting the other, and the second group, the five kings, thought that they could break free, and the larger group is saying, oh no, you can't. So all the latter, the five kings, joined forces at the valley of Siddim, now the Dead Sea. In 12 years, they served Kedorlaomer, and in the 13th year, they rebelled. Again, the reason why people think that this was a tributary type fight of one coalition against another. In the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim at Ashtaroth, Kanaim, at the Zuzim at Ham, and Emim at Shavat Kiryataim. So this is why people argue that this was a parade of the four kings as they went through and quelled the various rebellions after people began to try and break away. Verse 6, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness, the Midbar, the desert. On their way back, they came to En Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and subdued all the territories of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who dwell in Hatzotzon Tamar. So you can see they're making their circle, their loop, through all of these potentially rebellious areas. And we see again the Amalekites, who we know continue to be a thorn in the side of the region, and of course the Amorites as well, who we end up having trouble with. Verse 8, then the king of Sodom, the king of Amorah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, which is Zoar, went forth and engaged them in the battle in the valley of Siddim. So just as an aside, literarily we see again the Torah's ability to give us the large headline captions of 4 kings versus 5 kings, and then give us a little bit of background, and then resume where the headline left off, which is in verse 8. In verse 9 then, King Kedorlaomer of Elam, King Tidal of Goyim, King Amraphel of Shinar, and King Arioch of Elasar, 4 kings against those 5. Verse 10. Now the valley of Siddim was dotted with bitumen pits, and the kings of Sodom and Amorah in their flight threw themselves into them, while the rest escaped the hill country. So the battle didn't go well for Sodom and Gomorrah and their allies. The 4 kings were able to defeat the 5 kings, and in the process of their army breaking and running, many of whom ended up in the hill country, which would be up from the Jordan plain up into the mountains in the center part of the country of Israel, and also therefore towards Abraham, as we'll find out. But in the valley itself, there were these bitumen pits, these basically like tar pits, that they would hide themselves in to try and avoid capture or execution. Verse 11, the invaders seized all the wealth of Sodom and Amorah and all their provisions and went their way. That's what you do when you conquer other people during this time. You loot them, you loot their city, you loot their wagon train full of army supplies, and then you take it. Remember, or I can't say remember because we haven't discussed it, but you should know that the ancient model of warfare was not always about attack, conquer, occupy, transform into part of you. That was generally awkward and costly. So instead, it would be attack, defeat, force them to pay you a large amount of money, and force them to continue paying you money every year afterwards until they tried to rebel again. It was a much cheaper arrangement, something that organized crime has continued to use today. You might call it protection money, where you are buying protection from your own threat. And so they came in, they looted, they left, and there would have been an expectation that these kings would go back to paying tribute. Notice as well, this was not a war of extermination. They were not trying to destroy these cities. They were trying to bring them back into proper tributary status so that they could get the money flowing out of them again. All right, everyone okay on the generic large screen version of this this war unfolding before we get to the particulars that involve the characters we care about?
Just, I want to say the reason they're fighting is to get wealthy. That's what they want.
Oh yeah, this entire fight on both sides is about money. Right?
And
nobody is fighting over ideology. Nobody is fighting over religion. Nobody is fighting over cultural differences. And nobody's necessarily even fighting over insult or personal grievance. They're each fighting because they think that the war will be cheaper than the amount of money they can get from the other side, or the amount that they would lose if they didn't go to war.
And that's such a contrast to what we're about to cover.
All right, so verse 12. They also took Lot, the son of Avram's brother, and his possessions, and departed, for he had settled in Sodom, in case you had forgotten that he had gone down to the plain. So, in addition to taking everyone else's loot, they also took Lot and his loot. And notice, of course, that the taking of captives was part of building up your wealth in the ancient world. So a fugitive, verse 13, a fugitive brought the news to Avram the Hebrew, who was dwelling at the terebinths of Mamre, the Amorite kinsmen of Eshcol and Aner, these being Avram's allies. Sorry, he has not taken the name Avraham yet. When Avram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he mustered his retainers, born into his household, numbering 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. So, just a little bit of both military as well as geographical knowledge. He musters his men, meaning the people that are with him that are capable of fighting. And there are apparently 318 men that are of military age and ability. And they are chasing after the army that had come through, the four armies, in order to, well, get back Lot and deal with the issue. So they are going as far as Dan, which is in the much northern part of Israel. Now, 318 people are able to move a lot faster than an army is able to move. So it's quite clear how he was able to overcome them. Verse 15. At night, he and his servants deployed against them and defeated them. And he pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So continuing their retreat up into the Fertile Crescent, up towards Mesopotamia, towards Damascus, which if you've been in the north of Israel, you know from the Golan, you can see all the way to Damascus on a very clear day. He is able to attack them and go up now after them. Now, as John had mentioned, this happens at night, and there's a question of exactly what that first word is, right? Vayechalek alehem laila, right? So one interpretation is that at night they divided their forces against them and attacked and won. As we're going to see, though, that term to be divided could also grammatically be applicable somehow towards the night, as in the night was divided. It's just an important ambiguity in the text that will be needed for a commentary when we get a little bit further on. But what's really important here is that this 318 guy group, which certainly would be assumed to have been smaller than the 5 armies or the 4 armies, was able to defeat the victor of the last battle. Now, defeat, what does defeat look like? Again, we're not talking about wars of extermination here or wars of conquest. We're talking about a war that would have sent them running, and would have sent them running, leaving behind the captives and, as we'll see, the loot that had been taken from the cities. So we don't have to necessarily imagine this as though Abraham and 318 guys just went in and killed thousands and thousands of soldiers. we can see it as being a very skillful attack and maneuver that, for one reason or another, forced the enemy four armies or four kingdoms to retreat in some form of panic and leaving behind the spoils of war. Indeed, that was the sort of normal form of war in many of these times and places, to say that the army that was able to stay cohesive and stay together was the army that won, and the army that broke from fear and ran was usually the army that lost. But we're not going to go into the full military details of this. But, yes, go ahead.
Josh,
Yes.
I think it's important when I was reading this is that by doing it at night, the larger army had no idea that there were only 318. So it was clever to do this at night.
Yes, in a number
because
of places.
They could create the illusion that there were many of them to panic everyone.
Right. There are many places throughout the Tanakh. There are many places throughout the Tanakh where nighttime raids allow a smaller group to attack a much larger group. And it's precisely because the larger group will not know how many people are actually coming against them because it's dark. And, you know, darkness is a big deal before you get night vision goggles or even flashlights. Verse 16. He brought back all the possessions. He also brought back his kinsman Lot and his possessions, and the women and the rest of the people. So we have in verse 16 sort of the completion of the war part, and then 17 onwards is the diplomacy between Abraham and the king of Sodom, the king of the city, and negotiating about how this is going to be handled after the fact. But verse 16 finishes this by letting us know that Abraham's raid was 100% successful for what it was trying to do, which is to say it returned the property, it returned the people, and allowed them to come back to where they had lived. Okay, any questions before we dive into our commentary? Or comments? All right. Just readjust where I've got my little windows. Okay. So let's go ahead and start off with our Vayehi Bimei, right? And it was in the days. These wars took place during the reigns of the kings described in these verses. Details of them will follow. Again, headline followed by details. We find a similar construction in Esther 1, Vayehi Bimei Achashverosh, and it was in the days of Achashverosh, the beginning of how the book of Esther is laid out. The main reason why the Torah gives us details of these wars, something that does not appear to be too relevant to our times, is to demonstrate the righteousness, courage, and sense of responsibility even for a nephew who had suffered a setback, as well as captivity due to his greed in settling near the Sodomites. When Avram knew that what he was about to do was something that morality demanded, he mobilized the few men he had and tackled the greatest contemporary war machine to liberate his nephew, being sure that God would assist him in such an endeavor. So there's a lot to unpack here. So let's go ahead and first of all begin with the notion that the Torah does not tell us about war, or indeed the rest of the Tanakh does not tell us about wars and battles, unless there is something that is relevant to us, meaning the current reader in every generation of the Torah. And in fact, there's not a lot of warfare happening in the Torah itself. We get a little bit here, we get a little bit in Bamidbar in the desert, we get a little bit of a recap of it during Deuteronomy, but that's about it. And even once we get into the rest of the Tanakh, wars are always being framed as something to teach a lesson of one form or another. They are not being described simply because it's interesting. That's not the focus of the Torah's historical analysis. However, the lesson that Radak is telling us that we should see in this particular battle is not the lesson of 4 armies versus 5. It's not the lesson of special forces operations. It's not the lesson of how to deploy your troops and divide them at night and all of that. The lesson we should see is if something needs doing, you do it. That you have to have courage and you have to be guided by righteousness and a sense of responsibility to do what needs to be done. And Abraham, or Avram, I'll apologize for slipping back and forth, that Avram here is setting about to make an example of how to behave morally in the face of a great threat, that one does not shirk from the responsibility just because it looks like you have no chance of victory, but instead you go out and you do what you know to be right. We know this happened during World War II in particular, where we had numerous partisans and resistance fighters all over Europe, many of them Jewish, many of them not Jewish, who were trying to fight against the Nazi war machine. Did they think they would win? Probably not. But did they think that they had to try? Absolutely. And were they willing to demonstrate that courage to take up that responsibility, to show that they knew what was right and wrong, and to act? That was the lesson that we should take from this section, says Radak. Now, Abraham luckily has God's protection in a way that the rest of us cannot quite depend upon. And so Abraham knew that he would be successful, but even then he knew he had to muster his troops. He couldn't just walk himself to try and take on the army. Moving on to Midrash Tanhuma, taken from Psalm 37, verse 15, their sword shall enter their own heart. Very poetic phrase, but what does that mean? These were the 4 kings, for until then there had been no war in the world. Meaning, who is it whose sword enters their own heart? This is the 4 kings of our story. Why? Well, according to the Midrash, this is the beginning of war as a concept. What is its proof? Well, it's as stated. Now it came to pass in the days of Amraphel that they began to make war. Now, the Midrash is reading a very literal sense here. Rather than saying this was the beginning of their campaign, the Midrash is saying, no, this was the beginning of war. This was the beginning of one group using force in order to compel another group to do its bidding. And that ultimately is the essence of warfare. When one side or both feel that through the exercise of force, they will be able to get a better arrangement of life and their situation than if they didn't use force. The Holy One said, wicked ones, you have started using the sword. The sword shall enter the heart of those same people. As stated, their sword shall enter their own heart, from Psalm 37. Immediately Abraham rose up against them and killed them. As stated, then he deployed against them by night. So Midrash Tanhuma here is trying to tell us that in addition to saving his nephew, that Avram was an instrument of God to bring about an immediate punishment to those who had instituted this practice of warfare, those who had created this notion that unfortunately humanity would perpetuate, that, if I just use a little force, I can probably make my situation better. Just going to have to kill a few people, or at the very least threaten them with death, and then I'll be able to be better off than if I didn't. And God is saying, such a wicked decision that has contributed to so much pain and suffering. As an aside, again, is this historically accurate? No. We know that warfare began before this, but the Midrash is drawing our attention that warfare did not exist in the Torah's narrative before this. And the question would then become, why would the Torah wait to tell us about war until this point? And the answer that the Midrash is giving us is because Abraham is being seen as the antithesis of someone who would behave like this. And indeed, we see later on in the section that we didn't get to read together, that when it comes time to divide the spoils of war, Avram has no interest whatsoever in the loot. He is not interested at all in the money. He did not go after his nephew and everyone else just to get rich. He did what he did to be right, which is, of course, the exact opposite of the war that was being perpetrated at the beginning of the chapter. Questions or comments? All right, moving on to Esther Rabbah. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani said in the name of Rabbi Yonatan, any place that it is stated, and it was in the days of, it is nothing but a term of grief. So what Rabbi Yonatan is trying to advocate here is a rule for reading the text, that anytime you see Vayehi b'mei, and it was in the days of, that what you are about to read is going to be a grief, a story of grief. So, and it was in the days of Amraphel, the section we read. What grief was there over there, right? What was the grief that we needed to be worried about? I mean, war is aside, but there has to be something more specific to the Tanakh's narrative of our people to make this a particularly grievous issue that would earn this introductory phrase. They made war to kill Abraham, our father. As it is stated, they made war. So Esther Rabbah is implying, a little bit confusingly here at the moment, that one of the objectives of the war, if not the objective of the war, was to kill Abraham. That the war was not just about attacking these other cities that had rebelled against them, that the war was almost a pretext, that the war was in some way, shape, or form meant to also overtake and include Abraham as one of its victims, which of course is a great danger and something that we should be grieving over. Now, why would that be it? Well, let's dig a little further. Rekedah Rabbi Eliezer argues the sixth trial of Abraham, by tradition Abraham faced 10 trials, was when all the kings came against him to slay him. Again, talking a little bit about paranoid, right? We got 4 armies versus 5 armies, and everyone thinks that it's about Abraham, that that's the one target. They said, let us first begin with the house of his brother, and afterwards let us begin with him. Right? On account of Lot, they took all of Sodom and Gomorrah, as it is said, and they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah. Afterwards, they took Lot captive and all his wealth, as it is said, and they took Lot and his goods. So Rekedah Rabbi Eliezer is trying to argue that, yeah, it was about Abraham from the beginning. How do we know that? Because in addition to saying that they attacked Sodom and Gomorrah, it goes on to tell us the particular detail that they specifically made sure that they took Lot and they took his goods as well. Now, whether this was meant to provoke Abraham into a conflict, or whether this was meant as a way to diminish Abraham by taking his ally, it seems that the text is hinting that Abraham was the ultimate goal of this exchange. And that
Rabbi?
Yes.
The one I was looking at Abraham's trials, and there's in Avo 5, it says, you know, Abraham was tested 10 times, but there are several versions of what the tests were.
Yes.
And I'm looking at a list by both Rashi and Rambam, but both Rashi and Rambam do list this as one of his tests.
Oh, absolutely.
So
this is one that is sort of generally agreed on.
Yeah.
I think most of us would consider that a war is always going to be a bit of a trial. All right, Tanhuma continues then. What do we know about Abraham that this might be a person that would need this much attention? So this text, the argument goes, is related to Isaiah 66. Thus says the Lord, the heavens are my throne, for all these things my hand has made. But to this person I will look, unto one who is lowly and of contrite spirit, who trembles at my word, who slaughters the ox, who slays a human, who sacrifices the lamb. All right, a little ambiguous in context of who is this person? Who is trembling at the words of the Holy One? This is Abraham. How do we know Abraham would be called somebody trembling at the words of God? Well, we see from Genesis 18, then the Lord was awesome to him, appeared in Norah, was awe-inspiring to him, which implies a sense of trembling reaction. Now, if you really want to know that the text is speaking about Abraham, sorry for not capitalizing him there, see what is written. Who slaughters the ox? That's the next condition of Isaiah 66. This is Abraham, right? Because we know in 18:7 that Abraham ran to the herd. We know that when the angels appeared to him, he went to the herd to slaughter an ox in order to give them food. Who slays a human? How do we know he killed anyone? The one who killed Nimrod. Wait, he killed Nimrod? Hold on to that thought. Who sacrifices the lamb?
Amraphel.
When did this happen? When he offered up his son Isaac, as stated in Genesis 22, God will see to the lamb, my son. So Abraham fulfills, according to the Midrash, all three of the criteria that are given in Isaiah 66, that this is somebody who is sacrificing an ox when he fed the angel visitors, that he sacrificed the lamb when he tried to sacrifice Isaac as the lamb, my son, and that he and that he killed a human. We know that as well because of killing Nimrod. Now, Nimrod is going to need a little unpacking. Rashi helps us here. He says that Amraphel, one of the four kings that were coming against them, is identical with Nimrod, meaning it's a different name for the same person, who said, Amar, right, to Abraham, plunge, pool, into the fiery furnace, right? So the idea here is that if you take that phrase, it becomes Amraphel through a Hebrew variation. So why would Amraphel, Nimrod, be a big issue for Abraham? And what's this whole fiery furnace? Well, again, you're going to have to go back to earlier midrashim and earlier discussions that we've had. Can't do everything as much in depth in every class as I might like, but short version, it is believed that Nimrod, who is mentioned during Parashat Noah, was somebody who was in charge of Ur Kasdim, of the area where Abraham grew up, and that Nimrod was adamant that Abraham, or Avram as he was called at the time, give up this foolishness of monotheism, because Avram was attacking both physically and ideologically the idolatry of Nimrod's kingdom. And the argument goes that he forced Abraham to be thrown into a fiery furnace, which is why Ur Kasdim is often referred to as the place of the fiery furnace, in order to prove that Abraham had no true understanding of God and that there was no such thing as God. And of course, Abraham survived. So the argument would then be that Amraphel and the other four kings may have been coming to loot the other cities, but they wanted to kill in particular Avram because he was continuing to perpetuate and indeed expand his monotheistic teachings in this land. And so this was an expedition that may have also been about money and tributary, but primarily, according to this line of thinking, was about trying to silence this idea of there being one God, one righteous God, and that Avram was trying to spread this message. Questions or comments? And as always, yes, I know that there are other ways to interpret and read all of this, and it may not seem as literal or even convincing to everybody who reads it. But know that the commentaries and the midrashim, when they do wordplay like this, are not trying to present the knockdown, drag-out conclusion. Indeed, there are usually multiple interpretations, even within the same text, but instead are trying to draw our attention to a much more important truth. In this case, the idea of the world of idolatry against what Abraham was trying to build. All right, then we advance. The Holy One, blessed be He, guards the wealth of the wicked for the sake of the righteous. Beautiful phrase from the Midrash, trying to basically say it may look like these evil people who are rich are sitting on a pile of gold and they've got it made, but in fact, God is simply using them as a bank. Right? They are sitting on the gold, but the gold doesn't actually really belong to them. They're just the guardians of it until God brings it over to the righteous. How do we know this? He declared, I will cause the kings to quarrel among themselves so that Abraham may attack them and seize their wealth. Right? Why else would these 4 verses 5 thing be happening? How do we know this to be so? And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel that they made war with Bera, etc. They made war against Bera because he was wicked in the sight of God and man. They made war upon Birsha because he had behaved evilly. They made war, fought against Shinah because he detested the heavenly Father, and Shemeber because he had said, I will ascend with a wing above the heights of the clouds, of this great arrogance. So the idea being that they were wicked, they did deserve to receive the punishment and the warfare that they had, but this was God stirring the pot of history in such a way that the wealth that they had accumulated would end up in Abraham's domain. That this would eventually reach him because their own wickedness would lead to their downfall in a way that would set Abraham up to take advantage of it. So they may have thought that they were doing their own deeds. They may have thought they were on their own mission, but according to the Midrash, they were in fact just carrying wealth so that it would end up with Abraham. Okay. Let's get one more Midrash all together here. Another interpretation of now it came to pass in the days of Amraphel. This text is related to Psalm 44. Through you shall we push down our adversaries. Through you, right? What do we mean by through God? We will push down our adversaries. This means through your law. Right? We can't just wield God like a sword, but we can use Torah. We can use God's laws in a way that will allow us to push down our adversaries. And the psalm continues, and in your name we shall trample down those who arise against us. What does that mean? Abraham said, Sovereign of the world, if you had not united your glory with me and helped me, what could a single person have done against 9 kings and their forces? However, because you helped me, they fell at my hand. Right? This name, that trampling down those who rise against us in God's name, doesn't just mean we will be waving the banner of God. It means that with God's assistance, we are able to overcome those who arise against us. And Abraham is making this very clear because he was able to have this amazing success, and he credits it entirely to God being with him. What is written, right? How do we know this? And the night was divided against them. Again, this idea of did they divide at night or did the night get divided? The sages say, the night divided on its own accord. Right? The night is splitting up. Rabbi Benjamin ben Yafet said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the Holy One, the one who knows his moments and his instants, he divided it, meaning that it was actually God who split up the night. The Holy One said, you have worked with me from yesterday evening until midnight and killed my enemies, meaning Abraham's assault against those who were enemies of God. By your life, the way you would make an oath, I am working with your children from midnight until the morning and killing their enemies. Where do we see God working for the second half of the night? Exodus 12. And it came to pass in the middle of the night, meaning the last plague, the death of the firstborn in the land of Egypt, which of course was the final push that allowed us to leave Egyptian captivity. And of course, as we saw in our Genesis, and it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, and the night was divided against them. That these sort of serve as a bookend. That in the days of Amraphel, right, we worked against God's enemies, and God helped us overcome them. But this night being divided is trying to tell us not just about that incident of Abraham dividing himself or his forces or attacking at different points during the night, but that the first part of our actions were done by us, for us and for God. And the second part of the night was actually in reserve, and God was keeping his part of the bargain by acting against the Egyptians when it was time to set us free during the Exodus from Egypt. So again, highlighting the way that Midrash will try and see the parallels between what seems to be very divergent texts. No one would have thought the Exodus from Egypt would be immediately connected to the attack by Abraham against those who had abducted his nephew. But the similarity in language and the similarity in theme is something that brings them together through the Midrashic mind. Questions or comments on that? All right, then we will move towards our ending. These 4 kings foreshadowed the 4 kingdoms that would have dominion over Israel: Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. But in the end, Israel would be victorious over them. So this is from Ramban, Nachmanides, as he is sometimes referred to in the Latinization of his name. So the idea here is that we had 4 here, and we will have 4 later. This is based off a general principle of many of the commentaries, that one of the reasons why the stories of Genesis concern themselves with all of these relatively minor incidents in the lives of our ancestors is not just to give us great stories, but because the activities and the events that befell those ancestors were a mini prediction, a mini map for the long periods of history that would come for the rest of our existence. So what happened to Abraham will happen to us. What happened to Isaac will happen to us in different generations. So the idea here that Ramban is conveying is that there were 4 kingdoms that Abraham had to confront, and there have been 4 kingdoms that Israel had to confront: Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And the idea being that just as Abraham had to confront them and was considered an insignificant person, so too we will have to confront these different kingdoms, and we too will be victorious. Now, the definition of victory here is very, very important, because who won the war between Babylon and Israel? Well, Babylon, right? It was Babylon that attacked and conquered our country. It was Babylon that besieged Jerusalem, breached its walls, and destroyed the temple. It was Babylon that took us as captives back to their land. It was Babylon that won. But who won? Well, Babylon collapsed under the Persians, and Israel, we were allowed to return and to continue our faith. And so too with Persia, Greece, and Rome. All of these other states at one point or another were hostile to us, and all of them eventually were destroyed by the other kingdoms, and most importantly now, a few thousand years on, no longer exist at all in a way to dominate us. So our victory was not that we became the superior empire to dominate them, but our victory was the victory of the righteous over the wicked, of the few over the many, the continuation of what is right in the face of what appears to be strong but wrong, and the ultimate survival of what is right, going all the way back to our very first commentary by Radak, where he said that what Abraham was doing was standing up for what was right, and doing so because he could imagine no alternative. And indeed, Radak as well is going to finish us off with his final commentary here at the bottom. If the 4 kings proved victorious over greater numbers than themselves, 4 verses 5, this was due to God wanting that Avram acquire the reputation of being a mighty warrior. Right? This is part of the way in which God fulfilled his promise, I will make your name great, back in chapter 12. when God is first giving Abraham his mission. So why did 4 have to fight 5? So that you would know the 4 were pretty amazing because they were able to defeat 5. And now when Abraham comes to defeat 4, he will look even more impressive. All right, Abraham fighting just 4 sounds good, but Abraham fighting the 4 who beat the 5 sounds even more impressive. Just like for any WWF, Federation, World Federation of Wrestling, they'll build up to the major match by showing you who the opponents have beaten. So too, for us to be impressed by Abraham, we have to first be impressed by those he is about to beat. It was also designed, and this is, I think, where Radak is trying to make an even more important point. It was also designed to demonstrate to the people at large Avram's righteousness and his abiding trust in the Lord. Without whose help, such a victory by 318 men over the mightiest armies of that period had been inconceivable. Concerning Avram and the men of his ilk, Solomon wrote in Proverbs 29:25, "He who trusts in the Lord will be safeguarded." Now, what is Radak's final message here is that ultimately this wasn't a victory to show us how powerful Abraham himself was in military sense. This was to show us how powerful Abraham was in his righteousness, because that was ultimately the goal of choosing Avram, making him Abraham, and making the Jewish people out of him. It wasn't to prove our physical superiority. It wasn't to prove military superiority, although those things are important. We need to have strength. We need to have a military. We need to have an ability to defend ourselves wherever we are. But ultimately, that is not our true victory, right? Our ultimate true victory is to create greater righteousness in the world. Our ultimate true victory is to make sure that there is an understanding that this was with God's assistance, and therefore that God's name and God's impact on the world would be magnified. And if that doesn't happen, then the war is not over and we haven't won. Even if we were able to stop people militarily, if greater understanding of God's righteousness and God's wish for there to be an end to this creation of war that came about, as the earlier Midrash said, through this greed and meanness, until we get that, we're not done fighting. And our fight is not just with the force of arms, but it's with the force of ideas, which after all, as the Midrash also implied, was the real reason why the kings were coming to attack Avram. It was trying to destroy this idea that might doesn't make right, and that God wants a righteous world, not just mighty armies.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I know in Psalms it says, let Israel now stay with the Lord at our side. This idea that we have a partner whom we can trust, that we're in a covenant relationship with. It reminds me of the scene in Joshua when he's coming up to Jericho and he looks up and he sees the man standing opposite him with the sword, the messenger, and he says, "Are you with us or against us?" And he says, I am the commander for Adonai's legion. It's we never know where that help is. It reminds me as well, we're told Magan Avraham, Abraham's shield. This is something that we're seeing in this section of text, is God really being his shield in a way that's quite manifest in unexpected and beautiful ways.
So exactly, and as much as this is an interesting story about the military and about his military accomplishment, it's important to see that our commentaries all agree that this was not included just to give us an exciting action sequence for Abraham's narrative. This wasn't here just to make the Hollywood producers have a place for the car chase, if you will. That this was here to teach a much bigger lesson as well. Any other comments?
Rabbi, would Yeah, can you hear
Yes.
me? All right. I wonder, would Abraham have gone out if it hadn't been that his nephew, I mean, it seems to me that there's a whole lot of, it's because that is much more of a tribal or a family thing, that he goes out and rescues him. Not that he's defending, I mean, how could he defend Sodom and Gomorrah? They were infamous cities, even then. So I see it kind of like a, this is a rationale afterward. And it's literally, I'm not letting them take my net that makes it personal. Would he have defended Sodom and Gomorrah if his nephew hadn't been taken?
So it's a great question.
Does that make any sense?
It makes perfect sense. We have no way of knowing exactly what Abraham would have done. However, we can make a couple guesses. One, when God tells him, oh, by the way, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham does defend them. Abraham does stand up for them and argue that they should not be destroyed. So there's definitely an element that he was willing to argue with God on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah, regardless of how wicked they were. Part two is this may also be telling us that, yes, Abraham may not have gone after them if it had not involved him and his family, but caring about your family and doing something about those that you love is the first step towards understanding that righteousness demands that we act for a broader circle of people. If you're not willing to act for yourself, if you're not willing to act for your family, if you're not willing to act for your extended family, then you'll never end up acting for anyone else. And we see sort of the progression here that Abraham may have been triggered or baited, depending upon how you look at the story, into action here. But the fact that he was willing already put him a step above everyone else who had just written off as lost, those who had been taken captive. Presumably other people as well had been affected, all of the survivors that had run up into the hills, for example. But Abraham was not willing to let it go. He wanted to defend his family. And that doesn't make him a bad person or even a more limited person. It just means he is showing the growth that comes from greater and greater connection to God that makes us think about a larger and larger circle of concern of those that we need to be looking to help.
Rabbi, I have a final question. It relates to what Charlene said. You know, when he saves Lot, it's almost as if he has saved an entire nation. Unless he saves Lot, there will never be a Moab. If there's never a Moab, there will never be Ruth. There will never be a David. So, in a way, we see by saving Lot, he has saved a future nation and made it possible for that part of the story to come into being.
Very, very much. And, we see in the teachings of our sages that if you save one person, you save the entire world. Because after all, only one Adam, one very special human was made at the very beginning. So even if you're not in a position like Abraham to defeat a massive army, if you can save one, that is still always a worthwhile goal. All right, well, we're going to finish there for today. Be well, everyone, and take care. And I hope to see some of you tonight if you would like to study Mishnah with me at 7 o'clock, and others of you tomorrow at 6 o'clock for the Pathway to Judaism class. Take care.